Hello and welcome back to the IPA's Looking Forward, a weekly podcast of debate and discussion about politics and ideas. It's another packed show today as we look at the frenzy of pulling down statues that's taking place all over the world as supposedly we erase the past. Can it be erased? We'll be talking about that. We'll also be looking at the stories coming out of Victoria about branch stacking, but we mainly want to talk about what that means for politics in general. What light does it shed on the business model of political parties and how they actually operate in the real world, not the world of myth? And then finally, for sporting fans and just anyone who's trying to get out of this COVID-19 lockdown, we'll be revisiting a story from a month or so ago, which is the NRL really the litmus test of how you actually get your industry out from under these government restrictions? Amazingly, I owe Zach Gorman $10 because I said there was no way the NRL was coming back in May, but they managed to do it. Should other organisations take a leaf out of their book? We'll be talking about that. We'll also have our usual books and culture segment, including celebrating the 10th anniversary of internet sensation PewdiePie. We'll also have a book on the history of the Delta Blues. And I will be talking about The Mirror and the Light, the concluding novel in Hilary Mantel's Wolf Hall trilogy. To help us work through these issues, I have with me, of course, my co-host from RMIT University and adjunct fellow at the IPA, Chris Berg.
G'day, Scott.
Great to have you. And returning to the desk of power is historian, proud son of the Illawarra, NRL fan.
Barry. I embody the colonial experience. That's why I understand it.
Embodying the colonial experience. Dr. Zach Gorman, welcome back to this. But yes, we've been following, of course, what started as Black Lives Matter and then became about police injustice and statues. Chris, what's going on?
Well, that's right, Scott. As you know, culture war is always going to beat real public policy change, and it is a bit of a shame that the very serious discussions we were having about police brutality and police reform in the United States has turned into a debate about statues. It is actually a serious and interesting thing. So it started with a movement really to rename a lot of military bases in the United States. For example, Fort Benning, Fort Bragg, Fort Hood, a lot of the most famous military bases in the United States are named after Confederate generals. And for those of you who know your history, the Confederacy did not win the Civil War. Donald Trump has stood up against this move and has declared that these monumental and powerful bases have become a part of our great American heritage. Simultaneous to this, there's been a renewal push to pull down a lot of Confederate statues as well, which has in fact spread across the Atlantic and even spread to Australia. The United Kingdom has had to board up its Winston Churchill statue. There's been debates in Australia about the statues to Governor Macquarie and Captain Cook and all these sorts of things. There's a lot to unpack here, Zach, but I thought as the IPA's, or one of the IPA's resident historians, maybe you could explain to us a simple question. Why do we have statues at all? Any statues?
To embody the concept of progress that we seem to have lost. So, the idea has always been that we are standing on the shoulders of giants, that we can see further than the previous generations because of their achievements. The idea that undermines their achievements is a sort of a psychosis that doesn't make sense in the Western narrative.
So sort of take us through that. So, and we'll get to the specific people who are being eulogized by statues or remembered by statues. But take us through sort of the logic behind that building on progress side of it.
Yeah. So the idea is that the idea of Western civilization, deeply ingrained, is that progress matters. That sort of the Enlightenment, all these sorts of things, is the idea that each generation will build on the next generation. And now instead of looking to the next generation, we started looking back towards the last generation. So of course no progress is going to be made if that is where society is focused.
Isn't progress also a little bit about moving past the past as well?
Yes, but that's where this concept of sentiment is that everyone's really feeling at the moment has been lost. That yes, you need to move on, but you got to realize that there are people that the mistakes that happen in human history are generally the consequences of decisions made by elites, but the emotions attached to them are attached by the masses, and you need to have a certain decorum about the sentiment of the masses. So maybe it is time to emotionally move on from some of the Confederate statues. Of course it is. Of course, that is an absolutely horrific part of the American narrative, the slavery narrative. But the blood for that was shed in the Civil War. America once knew this, and they seem to have forgotten.
So this is a interesting take on it, Zach. So let's take someone like, say, Prime Ministers of Britain, before we get to Churchill, like Gladstone, who was a classic progressive Liberal Prime Minister, sort of his age, is almost invented the idea of the crusading human rights politician. But I mean, 10 years ago, the postmodern left would have said, "I'm not interested in dead white males." They were sort of, it was proud of being uninterested in history. So what's happened that we've gone from being uninterested in history, everything's year zero, to now we're becoming obsessed with it and wanting to refight some battles and say, well, he was in favour of human rights, but he also believed in attaching that, making that an empire project. So therefore, it must be a bad thing. You know?
Or he had family relations that were involved in the slave trade, rather than himself. And
yeah, I mean, everyone in Britain had family relations that were, had sugar plantations in the West Indies, or they'd invaded Ireland, or they'd. I mean, I think there's only 3 countries in the world that
they haven't invaded.
They haven't invaded, so you can always find something in Great Britain. And that, by the way, that was Jeffrey Blaney's point about Britain. He said, when you've got 1,000 years of continuous history, there's a lot to find once you go looking for it.
I think the thing that we've forgotten is that Gladstone was elected. The people in charge of these democracies in the West have this sense that they can dictate to the people right now what they should or should not be doing, whereas the traditional relationship and the relationship that made democracy work was that it was about the people deciding what the leaders get to do.
Well, is that also is it about scapegoating then? I'm really making this up as I go along, but it's a refusal to own the collective history of your nation, rather? Is it just easier to then put it onto one individual and say if we tear down that individual? I mean, that is the psychological mechanism of scapegoating that what's his name, René Girard, the philosopher, talked about.
Well, it's sort of like the left and right sides of politics embody 2 truths, that we are individuals, but we're individuals as part of a community. And those 2 concepts need to coalesce.
So these are all beautiful sentiments, guys, and thank you. But
bring it back down for us, please, Chris.
I might just pull us a little bit down and give you my perspective. And it is absolutely right that we pull down statues that commemorate people who have done things that we agree are primarily famous for horrific or very disreputable things. So certainly Winston Churchill may have made mistakes as Prime Minister, but he is commemorated as Prime Minister in the United Kingdom because of his leadership during the Second World War and his leadership in the defeat of the Nazi Empire. The Confederates, however, are famous. The Confederate generals are famous for fighting in defense of slavery and against the United States. And so it seems to me to be an unambiguous good to remove those statues. You're not removing history. You're not eliminating history. You're declining to commemorate their negative deeds in public, because we don't lose our history. We learn more about it over time, but we're never going to lose our history, and it is always deeply important. I mean, my PhD is in history. Jack, your PhD is in history. History is fundamental to the way we imagine ourselves, but the choices of what we have in our streets and the things that we commemorate is a choice that this generation makes. Am I wrong, Scott?
Well, what wrong about is that is a nice academic way of thinking about it. And if only
How dare you?
If only we were focused on a democratic process and a reasoned discussion in the manner in which you were speaking. I mean, someone has pointed out that the statue of the slave trader in Bristol, that has been the topic of local debate for a long time, had been to the City Council for a discussion and was probably going to go back again. That is a very different thing than an angry mob just getting some ropes and tearing the damn thing down.
Yeah.
And then it's a fait accompli, because that is giving into the mob, and it's its meaning completely changes, and that's plus, of course, when you get to Churchill, it's the sheer bloody ignorance of history.
Yeah, and there's been more than a few examples of that. One, I was just looking at today a statue of the anti-slavery abolitionist John Greenleaf Whittier in California was vandalized overnight, which is obvious that there is a group of people in these protesters that's just targeting statues for the sake of statues, under the assumption that anything in our history is, or anything in modern history is condemnable. But a lot of it is, right? So the King Leopold III statue, was it third, second? The King Leopold II statue in Belgium is his actions in the Congo at the end of the 19th century and early 20th century were genocidal, and the Belgians have pulled down his statue quite rightly.
No, because the scariest thing would be if humanity forgot its capacity for evil. We have to remember our capacity for evil. What we forget about the Confederate statues is that they were erected after the South had lost the war.
Quite long after.
Yeah, they were part of the process of healing, and they're also part of this need to embody the sentiment of the masses, because the truth is that the vast majority of people who fought for the Confederacy were not slave owners. We used to be able to distinguish between who was culpable for their actions and for the actions of society and who's not.
Yeah, but the leaders would be in that list, right?
Yeah, but it's not about the leaders. The leaders,
but the leaders are the statues. The statues are of the leaders.
But this was,
and I don't want this sort of Marxist style, the anonymous worker type statues, because that's also very bad. But it is the statues and the leaders. So I take your point about the importance of symbolism and the importance of a national narrative and the importance of remembering history. But you can take that and recognize also that those symbols change, right?
No, see, I think this is the problem, is that we think it has to be either or, because we've lost our concept of sentiment. That we all have these stories that we are part of collectively that we can't be held responsible for. But you can't tell us to abandon our stories. It's too deeply ingrained in the sort of psychology of what it means to be a human.
Of course, but that doesn't mean you need to have the statues of Confederate generals fighting for slavery.
See, this is elite hubris. You are an elite, and you do not have the right to tell democracy what to do.
Academic, no less. No, well, so I should be clear, and I share entirely Scott's view on this, that I don't at all support the idea that we're going to make these changes to our streets, to our public sentiment by mob action. And a bill or legislative action that takes down statues that are obscene in retrospect or obscene in the modern view is the correct way to go about this. In fact, I'll point out that Victor Davis Hanson, who you would never accuse of being excessively woke, wrote in National Review actually a very sympathetic argument for removing the Confederate generals' names off the forts, off the military forts, and removing some of the statues by pointing out that let's just wait until the fires, let us wait until the fires in the streets, the occupations, the defacements, the looting, and the violence have dissipated, if only not to reward the bullhorn rather than the majority vote of elected or representative bodies. Now, reading that, I think he would support in a legislative action many of these removals of these symbols. That is my view to clarify.
One of the, and I can't resist though. I mean, back on Churchill, there's a wonderful story on the Daily Wire about people will remember Kathy Newman, who was famously bested by Jordan Peterson on Channel 4. She was interviewing a left-wing activist and was asking her about asking Lorraine Jones about what she thought about Churchill's statue and the threats to Churchill's statue, because this was an activist who generally supported everything that happened. But she was specifically asked about Churchill, and she said, "I've heard many arguments on both sides. Some say he's a racist, some say he's a hero. I haven't personally met him," she says.
Well, neither have I.
Yeah, I haven't personally met him. And even Kathy Newman's like, okay. So she comes back to it and says, "Yeah, what do you actually think?" And she goes, "Well, I'm going to be honest. I haven't done a lot of history work with Churchill."
Look, and there's
it's like, I mean, isn't this the apotheosis of everything that we've been talking about? At least he studied history. You studied history. Our listeners have some interest in the history of our country and our Western civilization, even if only to be able to have these discussions. And it's one thing to decide that it's bloody year zero, but the fact that it's only year zero because you have no concept of anything that went before, that is an indictment on our education system and our entire culture.
Is your objection then that this is a movement being led by idiots rather than we should keep... No, obviously we agree that Winston Churchill's monument should be left unmolested. But for the most part, is your objection that this is a movement in the Victor David Hanson criticism, that it's being led by rage, it's being led by ignorance, but you support removing those sorts of Confederate statues, for example?
As I said last week, actually...
Just to pin you right down.
Well, no, but when it comes to America, I mean, I don't have a dog in this hunt. Who am I to say what an American should do? Right. So I'm not going to express an opinion. Okay. I suspect I know what...
This will make a hell of a podcast.
No, but I suspect I know what I would do if I was in America, just as I suspect I know what I'd do if I was in the UK. But Australia is my country.
All right, let's talk about Australia then. So there has been... there were some scenes last weekend, I think it was, or just recently, where they had to defend the police actually had to defend the monuments of Captain Cook and Governor Macquarie.
And good on the New South Wales government and police for actually taking some damned action, unlike those in the UK. So
how should we, Zach, how should we think about that? So it's absolutely the case that these are not slave owners. These are not... they're not fighting in defence of slavery, but Australia does have some dark patches of its history. How should we think about the way we publicly commemorate those moments, or how we modify our views of past leaders?
Well, I think the thing to appreciate as the sort of world seems to be burning is how simple Australia is. It is Captain Cook and Macquarie. It is just a couple of people because we didn't really care. Our pretensions were never as high. So this psychosis that seems to be gripping society is not going to be as deep here because that wasn't us. We never had this image of Australia. And this is where the misunderstanding of Cook was, is that Cook is the embodiment of hope in the Australian story, which is the settler story. But there has always been the convict story as well, and the story of sorrow. The erected Captain Cook doesn't mean that the convict story is erased. But now we think, when we first erected that statue, we knew that. But now we think that the monument to Cook is trying to erase the other stories of sorrow in Australia's past.
Yeah, I think that's a really good observation too, because there's this idea that every statue has to embody every single part of Australian history to be legitimate, or we've got to have a room of statues that gives us a complete tale of the beauty and the horror of an entire nation's memory.
Yeah, well, this is the problem, that the darker parts of our past are hard to deal with. That is why we get academics to deal with them. But their ideas that these academics come up with are meant to just be presented out into the world, and then society will take them on when society is ready for them.
But this is also supposedly we're always being invited to have an encounter with history in the darker, through museums. That was the debate over the formation of the National Museum of Australia. the new one when it was built.
And the Melbourne Museum as well.
You know, it was a classic black armband view of history, which the Howard government in the end did force some changes, but it's not just that it was an unrelenting misery guts view of Australian history, sort of unmoderated black armband view, but it was never very successful or interesting. Like no one cared. I mean, this is the thing. I've seen memes going around on Facebook saying they should teach Indigenous culture in schools. Like they don't.
Yeah, you hear that a lot from people who haven't stepped in a classroom for 4 or 5 decades. Why didn't they teach this in the 1960s? Well, no, they didn't, but they absolutely teach it.
They
these
sure
days.
as heck do now.
They sure as heck do, and they should, and they absolutely should at the same time. And it does speak to a incapacity that we have from a public history perspective to hold those two competing or multiple competing visions of Australia at the same time. That we, in order to recognise injustices done to Indigenous Australians, we have to pull down Captain Cook's statue. We can't apparently do both. And that is a failure of the public history profession, if you will, and probably a failure of our public debate and public discourse that we can't. That apparently we have to fight each other over two starkly competing narratives about what Australia means.
And Zach, I want to come back to your point about the convicts. Is one of the other things that's happened, of course, is we also lose competing narratives of oppression. I mean, for a long time it was the free settlers versus the convict. I mean, is the convict history of Australia any part of the discussion anymore?
This is why everyone's going insane, because the masses aren't meant to deal with these level of questions. They were never the questions to be had. I have a tremendous amount of optimism for Australia, because the reason that we came to terms with multiculturalism in the end was because the narrative of sort of escapism and getting away from the world's problems was compatible with the narrative that we had already been telling ourselves through the convict, that we'd been cast out from Eden and we had to sort of make do here. And that is the sort of level of understanding that we need to get to, is that it's both. So there's a reason that it is the Labor Party that tends to identify these things first. It's because they have the embodiment of this sort of Irish Catholic experience of being the minority sort of group in Australia and having that sort of sorrow and these sorts of things. But it's up to society to decide when to progress. That sense of traditionalism embodied in the centre-right narrative is just as important to the yin and yang of society.
But the contest now is not between the convicts and the sort of settler narrative. It's between a white Australian and Indigenous
that's what I meant.
Australian history.
That's what I meant. The convicts have fallen out of the story altogether.
The convicts have fallen out of the story. But how do we, as centre-right, conservative, libertarian, what have you, thinkers, how should we think about that clash of visions about Australia's past? There's a history of dispossession and there's a history of creation simultaneously.
Yeah, I think that's what we need to appreciate, is that we are the upholders of one aspect of our character, but it is not the only aspect of our character, and that we need to incorporate almost in a catharsis sense the darker aspects of our past into a single narrative right now, because that's the problem. We've forgotten that our political parties are a manifestation of society. Okay. If we truly love Australia, you have to love all of it.
I agree. And my plea, so where I stand is if you're going to build national myths, though, they still have to have some correspondence to history, and at the moment they have none. So if you're going to say, I want to rename the McMillan River in Gippsland because that was a figure associated with Indigenous massacres, that's something that can proceed from historical examination of records, and you can have a discussion about that. But if it's just, blindly identifying any figure from the colonial times, when you're trying to ban a beer because it's called colonial, then you've actually taken leave of any sort of history. And of course,
it's not a precision strike, we'll say.
Yeah, and of course, this is the point being made by Indigenous leaders like Warren Mundine and Jacinta Price about by all means, look hard at the history, look hard at the present. Tell the whole story. That's the thing. Don't just swap one myth for another. That'd be my thing. So real history does have a role to play.
So that was Statue Talk with the Looking Forward podcast.
Speaking of the Labor Party and myths, we have had what I think has been a national story, but it started in Victoria. And, of course, Victorians have been shocked by allegations that there is branch stacking going on inside the Victorian ALP. As part of our new media landscape, research done by Nick McKenzie from The Age now runs on 60 Minutes, which has got to be the first episode of 60 Minutes I've watched in about 20 years.
Yeah, that's the same for me as well. So I do want to make that point, and it's a slightly cheaper point. But for years and years, we've been told that media mergers would lead to lower quality news media. This is a really good example of how a media merger in an environment where the media is under incredible financial strain actually means that on 60 Minutes you get really, really good journalism. The story, as almost everybody in Australia, I'm sure, knows by now, on Sunday night, 60 Minutes aired a joint investigation that found the Victorian Minister for Local Government and Small Business, Adem Somyurek, was directing alleged branch stacking and alleged widespread corruption. There was footage that showed MP staffers appearing on public money, rather than working their ministerial jobs or their electorate business. In fact, they were just spending their time playing Labor factional politics, getting large groups of paper members, and also implicating a number of other Labor ministers. Adem Somyurek has already resigned from the government and the party, but not, interestingly enough, Parliament. Two other Labor ministers in Victoria have also resigned
whilst protesting their innocence.
While protesting, I mean, of course, yeah. I just need time to think. And the Labor Party federally has now launched a takeover of the state Labor Party. There's a lot of aspects to this. We should probably talk a little bit first about the underlying accusation. Actually, no, I want to make a quick point though. And so I watched this really closely, the 60 Minutes documentary, the 60 Minutes show, and I'm a little bit uncomfortable with the revelation that there are hundreds of hours of secret recordings of a Victorian government minister. I don't know that that's a wonderful thing for us to hear about. And I do worry if we're just, we just record government ministers. Scott, you've worked for government ministers. How comfortable would you be with that?
This is more than an idle point. This was a secret recording of a government minister inside a federal electorate office.
Yeah.
And Anthony Albanese's been asked about this and conveniently dodged it. I suspect no one's thought to ask the Federal Attorney General or the Speaker of the House what they feel about
the Australian Federal Police
or the Australian Federal Police. It was reported in The Age today that people who'd been contributed to the show and appeared to speak on it were assured that it was entirely legal. Mm-hmm. Now, the only way it can be entirely legal is if they have been given permission to put that camera in the ceiling of a federal electorate office. And they're also told that Mr. Somyurek apparently all he wanted was a room to make a few phone calls. And they said, the other two rooms are locked. Why don't you go into this one? Yeah,
there's also the taping of the phone calls as well. I'm a bit familiar with the legislation in this because it was all to do with the data retention debate a couple of years ago, metadata internet retention. And You can't do that.
So
anyway, so this is a side point, but it is a thing.
But this is one of the things. So, but there are so many. The side points are the much more interesting points in all of this. So, if you read the ABC, the only thing yet the ABC has been able to report out of any of this is that Mr. Somyurek made some terribly misogynist comments. Therefore, he is a bad person. Therefore, he has had to resign. Now, the most of the stories I've read on the ABC website are unable then to explain why suddenly these other two ministers are resigning as well, because they didn't make misogynistic comments.
But that's not the bulk of the claim. I think that's a Labor Party defence strategy.
But I think it's a masterclass in Labor Party issue management, because they've focused in on the issue of misogyny as a distraction from how did this video come to be? Who gave it all to the Age in the first place? And what does it tell you about the ALP business?
So let's bring in Zach. Zach, quick question: how many political parties are you aware that you're a member of, and did you pay for your membership?
I haven't renewed my Liberal Party membership for a few years over a certain a certain social issue that the New South Wales government decided to get involved in. But I think really what we've forgotten is that the Australian secret is that power corrupts. There's a reason we had tall poppy syndrome. We were a populist country, and there's a darkness in that, and there's an ability to produce real horrors. But there's also a sort of truth in sort of feeling your way through issues.
And the thing about branch stacking, I don't mean to make light of it, but I think what the public probably wants of its political parties is an acceptable level of branch stacking or whatever it is that it takes you to run a political party. The less you know about the interior workings of a political party, the better for everyone.
So there's branch stacking is another word for getting membership, right? Okay, and getting members is part of what a political party does. And one of the interesting things about Australian politics is how few members of political parties there are. Can you just take me through, Scott? Because I don't quite understand this. So there's good branch stacking and bad branch stacking, as I said. And the bad ones are the ones where where the member hasn't paid on the day or has been paid for by someone else. Can you explain to me the intuition behind that? Like, why is that the problem?
Well, that specific allegation in the 60 Minutes episode, so that there's good branch stacking and there's bad branch stacking, and it isn't. And I'll come to that in a sec. But the specific allegation, so working backwards, is that the people who were named didn't even sign the application form.
Yeah, so which is unquestionably terrible.
Unquestionably terrible. That signatures were forged,
and trying to heavy someone to forge signatures as it appears in the
then that they neither did they pay for their own memberships, but that was paid for by funds provided by Mr. Somyurek or others, as the case may be. Again, that's the allegation. So that is against the Labor Party rules. You're meant to at least pay for your own memberships and sign and know that you're a member.
Ideally.
So, but
these people knew that they were members.
But this is the interesting thing, though. So here's good, and some of this is allegation of ethnic branch stacking. And one of the ministers who's resigned, Ms. Carews. Sorry, my apologies for not being able to lay my hands on.
Minister for Consumer Affairs, Gaming and Liquor Regulation.
Thank you very much. One of the conversations that they had is she's of Lebanese background, Mr. Somyurek's of Turkish background, and they're actually quite upset that they're being accused of ethnic branch stacking, because she says, I can sign up my mum and members of my family, and that's an ethnic branch stack, whereas if this other guy in the ALP, Tim Richardson, signs up 10 people, he's a hero. Mr. Somyurek replies, yeah, if you go to a left caucus meeting, you'll think you were at the Ku Klux Klan, before describing former Upper House Gavin Jennings as, quote, the chief Klansman. So I'm not buying into any of that, other than to observe that one person's ethnic branch stack is another person's effective recruiting.
Zach, is the problem here that the 60 Minutes show demonstrated that Somyurek regardless of what you think of his politics, is just a terrible, terrible bloke. He comes across as a massive brute.
No, the problem here is the conversation you two just had. The conversation is all that moral ambiguity, all that corruption that is innate to politics. And we know it's innate to politics. The lesson of the Lord of the Rings is trying to tell us something deeply ingrained in our psychology.
The lesson of the Lord of the Rings. I'm watching Lord of the Rings with my kids.
Okay, I have a public policy question then, because this is something that I do often think about. My proposition to you is that everything you say is true about small c corruption, if you like, that's inherent in the nature of the political process. Is it a good thing to then have statutory bodies like an ICAC or in Victoria an IBAC or this federal body constituted with virtually the standing powers of a royal commission, then to sit in judgment on the internal workings of a political party? Is that actually a good thing? Does that take us closer to achieving nirvana in democracy?
Well, this is the thing, is that until we understand that there are limitations to what can be achieved, we can't even have these conversations. There's a complete lack of maturity in politics at the moment, that it's sort of both the left and right have allowed themselves to be caught up in these utopian dreams, and they're all coming crashing down.
Yeah, and I think one of the things that the 60 Minutes episode does is demonstrate how distant actual politics as it is practiced is from those dreams. There was a fun quote in a Herald Sun piece by James Campbell as one cabinet minister, a Labor cabinet minister, but not a friend of Adem Somyurek, mused yesterday, quote, "Seriously, who in politics would survive having their private conversations recorded? ? I'll tell you, no one." This is politics as it is run. And one of the, I may have said this on the podcast. I've said most of my opinions on the podcast before, but I'll say this one again. One of the reasons that I'm a libertarian is because no matter what, if you want the state to do something, you end up vesting it in control of people who want to use the state for personal power and personal gain. And you get very strongly the impression from this report that Adem Somyurek was a Labor minister because that was the highest paid job they could give him, not because, oh, what a wonderful minister of, what was it, local government or something that he would make. He's just got a real passion for the local government.
And we should observe. By the way, the that quote about the Ku Klux Klan came from yesterday's Age. If anyone wants to look that up. And the other thing I wanted to say was, of course, we have talked about the Victorian ALP today. I would never want to imply that this is something limited to Victoria, but I also wouldn't want to imply that this is something limited to the ALP. No. There's been accusations of branch stacking, even in, say, Victoria with the Liberal Party, with a sudden influx of Mormons. go figure. I can't attest to the truth of that, and other states have their various issues as well.
My point is very hard to see. That is good, right? Bringing people into a political party because you want to build support for that political party. That's what those parties are for, right? That's by design. Now, the Labor Party has used the idea that if you've paid for your membership, then you're a genuine member. They're using it as a proxy for honest membership or something like that. But it means nothing of the sort. It doesn't mean you're an honest member. It doesn't mean that anybody who joined because they joined as part of Adem Somyurek's work is not an honest member, not a legitimate member of the Labor Party. They might be deeply passionate about Labor politics in the same way that many of the people that joined the Liberal Party in the last decade may be very genuinely interested in Liberal Party politics.
Yeah, so the problem is that the Richmond Football Club can get over 100,000 members, but the Victorian ALP can't get more than 16,000, and 4,000 of those are now thought to be dubious.
Yeah, and the people in charge of the Labor Party at the federal level are now going to decide which ones are legitimate. And if you don't think that there's politics going to be played in that when they're thinking about the stability of the Victorian government and the Labor opposition federally, then, you're kidding yourself.
And stability means we all get to keep our seats.
Precisely. I mean, one of the things
that's their definition of stability.
So again, James Campbell, and I have to go with his assessment on the underlying factional politics about this. Somyurek was preparing to roll a number of senior either ministers or parliamentarians, and now that the federal Labor Party has taken over, they all get to keep their seats. Conveniently.
So it is time to switch our gaze. I did mention the Richmond Football Club. It's time to talk about sporting codes. A few weeks ago, as we were talking about COVID-19, I talked about how hard we were going to have to fight to get out from under the restrictions which had been imposed. I said there was a ratchet effect. That's ratchet, R-A-T-C-H-E-T, effect coming out of the National Cabinet, which is easier to put restrictions on than it is to take them off. And the only way it's going to happen is for each individual and business to fight and kick and gouge. And at that time, the only example I actually had of an organisation that was taking that approach was the NRL, under the leadership of a guy whose name I'm not sure I can pronounce, but I'll defer to Zach. Volandis,
yeah.
Volandis. Oh, very good. Not too bad then. And he said he was going to be playing NRL, have the NRL back by May 28th. I commended him on his enthusiasm, but said there was no way it was going to happen. But it did.
Yeah, you heard it here last.
Well, because
why? How was he able to pull that off? And what does that tell us, Zach, about the things that you need to do to get up and operating under COVID-19 lockdowns?
The real power in Australia is with the people. So Volandis acted on instinct and knew that the vast majority of people in New South Wales would want the football back and demanded that the New South Wales government bring the football back. The problem is that in Victoria, it's all this like secret club where all the leaders of the football clubs are part of the political class. So they're all too concerned about what their other political mates think of them rather than what's actually good for the AFL.
I think so. The sort of is that a classic New South Wales picture of Victoria being run out of the Collins Street Elite, the old Geelong Grammar Boys or Geelong? I'm trying to remember where the McLaughlins went.
No, see, I think Sydney. There is again. This is why our stories embody national characters. Sydney, as our sort of founding city, still has a lot of our sort of core sort of psychology in it. And one of the things about the NRL is that it still embodies that old working class, that old Irish Catholic like concept of the working class that the Labor Party used to embody. And the left, the sort of leftist elites that are now controlling the Labor Party absolutely despise the rugby league. Like they're going to watch the AFL and go to the Swans and Greater Western Sydney as this will be more like the European city down south. So the psychosis in the Labor Party of the elites versus the people is really just an example of the psychosis of Australian society.
That's really helpful, Zach. That'll be the grab for this episode. I think, so I know nothing about NRL, and that's very clear, as everybody nods on the panel. But I think it's really interesting to, as you said, Scott, it's really easy to shut an economy down, turns out. In the space of a fortnight, the Australian governments, state and federal, sent us all to work from home, or at least most of white-collar Australia was sent to work from home. And now, if you call up any call centre, they'll apologise for the rubbish truck going past and all that sort of thing. But the reopening is really, really hard. Part of the reason it's hard is because the public policy decisions haven't been made yet. So we were talking earlier about the incredible ambiguity from state governments about, well, if you can work from home, you must work from home. But then, the city's starting to warm up. People are starting to come in. We're in a studio observing social distancing, but, we're in a studio right now. On the other hand, though, I worry that what we really need is more decisions like the NRL, because ultimately the choice to reopen will not be made from Josh Frydenberg's office or made from Dan Andrews' office. It'll be made by individual risk managers in companies. And until those risk managers are sure that they're not going to be prosecuted for reopening and that they're not going to be sued by their employees for reopening and that their employees are actually not scared to come back to the office, that's right now easily the biggest risk to our economy, that is slow, that takes a long time. In a year, we will be back in our offices. I guarantee it. In a year, we'll be back. But will it take us that year or will it take us 2 months? That choice is going to determine our future prosperity for the next couple of years.
I think it's this sort of psychology of the political class is that they've forgotten that politics is about, particularly in Australia, and this was Menzies' secret, politics is about solving a problem as they arise. And what's happened is that the political class has committed itself to solving every problem ever, constantly, and now a real problem has arisen, and they don't have the ability to deal with it because all their methods were about saving the world.
Yeah, but also, we gave them that power, and we as a society share in that delusion, and this is the problem. Out of this long, 29-year free of recession, the long boom that Australia had. The ability of second-rate managers to run so many corporations that they lost that ability to actually forge their own futures, to be entrepreneurial. Because one of the things about being entrepreneurial is you don't just create a great product. You generally have to set the rules of the game. That's part of what entrepreneurship is, whereas our corporate leaders are always like, we just want the government to tell us what the rules are. It's like they're all these renewable energy rent-seeking pissants. It's like, they got to just set give us some guidance on, we want a free market in carbon, but we want a decent carbon price that'll attract investment. So they're essentially saying, just keep subsidising it and, and give us a good carbon. Tell us what the rules are. And they've been doing this during COVID-19 as well. Tell us what the rules. And the more they do that, the more they get screwed. Yeah. So this is how the Victorian hospitality industry. Dan, somebody made the mistake of saying, we couldn't possibly reopen with 10 people. We'd never make any money. So Dan Andrews said, great, then we won't reopen with 10 people. Whereas in New South Wales, when that line was floated, Dominic Perrottet and others went, good point. Okay, we'll make it 50 then, because 10 is absurd. You got to fight and kick and gouge every step of the way, and it's not happening enough. I have no belief that we will supposedly unfreeze unless we fight for it.
Too much of Australian corporate life has been geared towards brand management. It's been geared towards converting to woke capitalism, and so much of that brand management and woke capitalism they do in Canberra. They wander the halls in Canberra, selling themselves as a vision of Australia as it could be, rather than and as you're right, Scott, that works really well if you have 3 decades of uninterrupted economic growth and everything seems great and we've got wonderful mining booms and cool. I mean, we can spend our time thinking about the brand of our company and how it fits into various social movements. But when you have a crisis, it does not suit the times. It does not suit the times, and a crisis requires courage which it appears that the NRL has shown, but courage which unfortunately we are going to have to see from every single company in the country if they are going to survive. Now, if they don't survive, and we've spoken about this before, and I suspect that we're going to see a massive amount of business failures when the JobKeeper wage subsidy ends, well, we're going to need new entrepreneurs to build new companies in an incredibly uncertain political, economic, social environment. And that's the scary part, and that's what should be keeping Josh Frydenberg awake at night.
Yeah, because one of the things PwC, one of its partners, made a great point the other day, that as we went into the lockdown, of course, the first things a lot of enterprises had to do was deplete their working capital just to ensure they survived, particularly in that sort of window until JobKeeper come along. So they come out of the lockdown with no working capital at all. How do you rebuild inventory, start taking staff back on? Because amazingly, staff are not productive on day one for the most part.
And really simple things like, so you have we've all been to cafes now, I hope, and we've all been to the occasional restaurants, and they've had to do a lot of significant changes to layouts, new furniture, removing lots of furniture. So they're working on smaller staff levels. They've had to make significant capital changes, and you just expand that through the whole economy. We don't know what sort of rules we're going to be required to do in July to reopen offices, or August or September. We don't know how often they're going to change.
When the borders are going to come down.
There's a lot of companies that are thinking very heavily about moving away from hot desking or from open plan offices. And
I also commend those who have taken the legal action against the Queensland government over the border lockdown and the impact that's having on the tourism industry, because clearly just presenting an economic analysis of the effect of the lockdown on the tourism industry is not having the desired effect.
I just think, I was thinking about this morning actually. So one of the biggest, so the Melbourne-Sydney air route is one of the most heavily trafficked air routes in the world. I think it's the most profitable or second most profitable or something like that. It has the most flights or second most flights in the world. We are a fully national economy, in part because of those connections in between the cities. Right now, there's something like 4 or 6 flights a day on that air route. We have done so much damage to our deeply integrated national economy. The amount of money it's going to take to restart those links, to rebuild those links is incredible. And nothing the Commonwealth government can do will help that, because, they're going to promise a lot of stimulus packages, and we could talk about the specifics of those, but they're not that interesting. And more to the point, they don't tackle the fundamental problem that there's not working capital available to these companies to make those necessary entrepreneurial changes.
Yep, and it's hard. And just as an aside, still on sport, cricket lost its CEO because he was unable to map a plan back towards
I actually haven't looked into it. Which city is he from? If we're talking about political culture, not that I don't think Sydney has been corrupted, because it is this elitism, the snobbery of the fact that people in the eastern suburbs felt they had to go for the Swans rather than an NRL football team says everything wrong with Australia right now.
That is the world through an NRL lens, but with an element of truth. We have come to that part of the show where we do our books and culture segment, where we talk about what we've been reading, watching and listening to. Shall we take it from
so
Dr. Berg?
as regular listeners know, I'm very embarrassed. I hadn't been reading many books, so I've read a book. Scott, I'm reading a book.
Good work.
I know, thank you. I appreciate that. So I'm reading a book on the history of the Delta Blues by Ted Giola, published in 2008. I previously actually talked on this podcast about a more recent book of his called Music, A Subversive History. But this older book is about the evolution of the Delta Blues, a very well-worn topic in musical history, but he's a fantastic writer and makes some really interesting points. The one I did want to bring out that I thought was the most interesting is, and he doesn't actually go into this as much as some of the histories of the blues do, but it's a really interesting point. It's how do you get from the musical culture of West Africa to the musical culture of the Delta at the start of the 20th century.
The Mississippi Delta.
The Mississippi Delta, my apologies. And he has some interesting speculation about how some of the West African traditions were translated over the course of a century. So disrupted by slavery and rebuilt or re-remembered, perhaps you might say, into the modern blues. And the point that he makes is West African music, as we know it, as we understand it historically, was very much focused on communities and large groups telling stories about shared histories and a lot of sort of call and response type work. And the puzzle is, well, how do you get from there, this community, large group, call and response stuff, to single or small groups singing songs about individual tales of personal disappointment, personal love. And he does make the interesting point that call and response is actually reflected in the fact that a lot of blues music and subsequent rock music repeats lines a lot. So they'll repeat lines over and over, and we think, oh, that's the chorus, that's cool. In fact, those are potentially, in his very speculative, admittedly, argument, a shadow of that West African call and response. That was what actually most interested me, because it's quite a cool way to think about the structure of modern music, and as listeners will know, but I should repeat, of course, it's interesting to study the Delta blues because it becomes such a deep part of the music that we have now in its many diverse genres, from rock to hip hop to everything.
No, that's where it all started, and it makes me also think of country music, which is more the sort of Scots-Irish tradition, up in the Appalachians, and I think there was a lot of cross-influence there too. I mean, that's why they call it. I like the phrase roots music. Yeah, blues, country. It's all jumbled up in there.
Yeah, and it tends to be poor communities. So of course the history of blues is a lot of promoters wandering around the Delta just recording everyone they can find, some good, some bad, in all sorts of genres, sometimes on musical instruments that barely functioned. And from that, of course, we've got all these incredible recordings of so many musical traditions that now, as music sociologists, are just pouring through them, trying to figure out, well, where the hell did this come from?
If I can be allowed a quick anecdote, I got interested in the blues like most, boring white guys do at some stage in their life, present company accepted, in the 90s, and went to the Byron Bay Blues Festival. And that was at a time when you could still trawl the Delta looking for these old bluesmen who hadn't yet been really recorded or made it. And there was a bloke called R.L. Burnside, who fit the bill. Like, he'd missed the first wave.
And the second and the third and the fourth.
Yeah, but they managed to find him. He was able to cut a few albums, and he was great. And but he truly lived the life. He'd been convicted for manslaughter, and he was asked about it. And he said, "Well," I said, "What happened?" And he said, "Well, I didn't kill anybody. I just put a gun to this guy's head and pulled the trigger. And what happened after that was between him and God." He went to prison for it, and then, this being the Mississippi Delta, he was required to pick cotton, essentially. So the governor let him out. That was how things were done.
In which decade was this?
This would have been 40s and 50s.
Yeah, okay.
That they were essentially used as the African American prisoners were used as bonded labour for the local landowners. So good news, you get out of prison. Bad news is you're going to pick cotton for the next 5 years and probably not be paid. So he'd actually lived the life. So it was a real tradition. That's my Delta blues story.
That's a good one.
But anyway, back to the 16th century. My book is Hilary Mantel's The Mirror and the Light, which is the final book in the Wolf Hall trilogy, tracing the life of Thomas Cromwell, advisor to Henry VIII. The first two books won Hilary Mantel the Man Booker Prize, and this might very well win a third, which would be absolutely unprecedented. It is actually truly magnificent, I think, as a novel, one of the best historical novel I've ever read. Unlike many historical novels like, say, War and Peace, which try to describe a theatre of operations, this, for 3 books in a row, you're just inside the head of Thomas Cromwell, this advisor, first of all to Cardinal Wolsey, who got on the wrong side of Henry VIII because he wouldn't give him a divorce, and then seamlessly Cromwell was able to manoeuvre himself into the employ of Henry VIII. It doesn't end well, spoiler alert, but if you know your history, there it is. It's
looking forward podcast listeners do.
Yes, that's right, as we all do. So this novelistic technique of it's not first person, but you're literally following him around the room, what he's touching, smelling, feeling, the conversations he's having with the king. And the other fascinating thing is it is unapologetically about the religious currents and the Reformation. It paints Cromwell as absolutely an agent of a Lutheran-style Protestant Reformation in England, as opposed to Henry VIII, whose only real interest was asserting his supremacy over that of the Pope. He wasn't necessarily interested in changing the doctrine all that much. So it's very much, I think, from what's almost the weak history of the Reformation in England, and that a true Protestant, not just Anglican, history of Britain. So I think that's got a bit of a blowback from Hilary Mantel in different parts, but it's fascinating in its own right. I believe the BBC will be making now a sequel to their 2015 Wolf Hall,
which was incredibly well done.
Incredibly well done. Hopefully they got Mark Rylance back. They actually compressed the first 2 books into that TV series. They should have, if it was Hollywood, they would have, or Netflix now, you would have made 2 series out of it.
It'd be a 90 episode.
Yeah, exactly. But there's certainly enough material for it. So if you haven't already read Wolf Hall, do go back to the start of the series and read that, and then work your way through them, because it's absolutely terrific.
So my culture pick this week is sort of just describing the benefits of hindsight. So now, as everything is collapsing, we can see why things happened. And an insight into the millennial culture is obviously that PewdiePie over the last decade has become the most popular YouTuber and has stayed there year after year.
Who's that? Sorry?
PewdiePie. His name is really Felix. He's a Scandinavian. He's from Sweden, now lives in UK. And he started off just doing video games and just sort of really inane nothingness. But then he sort of gradually matured over the years, and he's tried to incorporate talking about great books and certain things into his videos he puts up, and managed to get, say, a couple of million views on them. They're obviously not as popular as his sort of more crazy comedy ones that are his bread and butter, but it's still that sort of underlying journey that millennials are sort of going on with him, as this sort of sense of learning that they can project onto PewdiePie, because what they're screaming out is that there's no meaning left in anything. The rhetoric has taken over. The reason that boomers can't understand memes.
Zach was doing quote marks. I wanted to clarify when he said boomers.
Is because they're just a scream for, is there truth in the world? Because we have a generation that has grown up being taught that there isn't truth in the world, because rhetoric has taken over.
So
this is a journey of discovery with someone else.
Yeah, it's projecting, again, what becomes popular it reflects society, and it's both happening at the same time. So you have, the individual has to, like, PewdiePie is making his own actions on this journey, is making the decisions that are becoming popular, but it's then also a reflection of society that he becomes popular.
So, but is that almost a message of hope, Zach? That the millennials, having started from a position that it can all just be cynical and silly and at the surface, but it wasn't sustainable for him or his audience in the end.
Well, this is what we've forgotten, is that all the greatest ideas speak for themselves. And this is about this idea of the desire for power corrupts and all these things. It's the actual things that change the world for the good are done by the people who don't want the power. Their idea is so good that the politician has to take it up. It's not Thatcher that's the hero. It's the economists behind Thatcher that created the progress.
Minor point of order, Scott. Millennials. No, it's not about the millennials. It's Gen Z, so it's the post-millennial generation. I am a millennial. I was born in 1982. That is a old millennial, but that is millennial nonetheless. What we're talking about is a generation that many of whom were born after 2000. Many of whom were born after the September 11 terrorist attack. That is a completely new generation.
So you said PewDiePie had started 10 years ago. So no, we are. What generation are we talking about?
Yeah, so 2000. He's a year or two older than me. So he's so obviously there's a certain age gap that he tends to appeal to people sort of younger than him. Because he needed to be in that position of sort of a slight older but still understanding to be able to do this. But yeah, we project, we forget, people are lacking the ability to comprehend that there is a yin and yang. Like all civilizations have come up with this idea of balance for a reason. But it's the Aristotelian mean.
I will make that serious point though, because there is, I think so much of our political debate, particularly in the last decade, has been framed as millennials versus boomers, but there is another generation coming up with different ethos. They're not just digitally native, but they're genuinely educated by YouTube. They are on different social media platforms than oldies like ourselves. There is a new political contest coming up, which I want to know more about. But it will be a distinct political contest because it's a generation with distinct and new ideas.
Well, that's a point to point out, is that, this conflict between the millennials and the boomers is just a manifestation of the fact that we can't identify our elites anymore. The millennials want to blame people for what's going on, but they don't know who to blame, so they just blame the entire generation.
Gladstone.
Gladstone's
fault for everything. And Churchill. So some bloke called Churchill. We'll blame him. No, but we have to have faith in the young generation, because otherwise who will pay the taxes to look after us when we're old? The boomers know what they're doing. I think that is the only philosophy they have.
You'll never hear a negative word about today's taxpayers.
That's right, taxpayers of tomorrow. You have been listening to Looking Forward. Don't forget, Looking Forward is a podcast produced by the Institute of Public Affairs. If you're not already a member, please do go to ipa.org and see how you can join. And this is our end of financial year appeal. So please do keep those cards and letters rolling in, as they say in the classics, or you could do it online, ipa.org.au. Big thank you today to my co-host, Dr. Chris Berg.
Thank you, Scott. Good show, I thought.
Wonderful. We're completely unbiased. I just sprained something patting myself on the back. Dr. Zachary Gorman, thank you very much for coming in.
Thanks.
That's our mandatory NRL plug done for the next month. I'm Scott Hargreaves, editor of the IPA Review. Big thank you to Mitch and to Steve in the control room, and we'll be back with more Looking Forward next week.